of 6, and in a way, what we're going to do today is take basically the first move, like a big move, a radical move towards using everything that we've said now in order to try to break away from the paradox that was the most important paradox of linguistics in the second half of the 20th century, and suggest a new answer to the question of the relationship between form and meaning in language. All right? Let me just say a word or two very, very quickly about what happened here last time, just those specific things that we need for the lecture. Today, what we talked about, who is this? It's you. Okay. It's okay. Happens. The picture of language, as I described it through the first 3 lectures, was of a socially designed technology that is used in order to allow for people to communicate across what I call the experiential gap between them. Each and every one of us has experienced and is experiencing in a different way. The question of communication is the question of how we manage to produce a process in which people with different experiences can actually communicate with each other and sometimes understand each other, many times misunderstand each other. And what we said was a community establishes what we call the symbolic landscape, which is a model of the world which is based on the ongoing process of mutual identification of experiences across the experiential gap. Different members of the community find ways by pointing, naming, and other ways of a step of identifying points of experience which are similar enough between them. They call them by names, and linguistic communication is a process in which a speaker translates his or her experiential intent, whatever it is that that person wants to communicate out of their experience, translate the experiential intent into a symbolic message, a semantic message, which is basically a set of signifiers from the symbolic landscape, a set of building blocks from the model. That message is then translated in the mind of the speaker into an utterance, which is the corresponding structure in which the signifiers were replaced by the signifiers and arranged in a linear order, and then that utterance is uttered in spoken language by sound waves in sign languages with all kinds of manual gestures, facial expressions, and so on. And then the listener has to go through the same process, just the other way around, figuring out how to produce in his or her mind an utterance on the basis of the sound waves, then a semantic message on the basis of the utterance, then an experiential interpretation on the basis of the semantic message. And what we talked about last time, what we spent more time talking about, is the process in which a semantic message is produced in the speaker's mind on the basis of the experiential intent. Because this is the major problem, this is the major issue. How do you take an experiential intent, something that is not constructed already in terms of language, and create a message that is, or may be, the best first approximation that you can find to what you actually wanted to say. And the process that we talked about was one in which language, as the social technology, actually tells us, orders us, gives us a set of steps to go through. And the set of steps together are part of our linguistic knowledge. I called it the communication protocol. What the protocol tells you is exactly how to proceed in your language in the process of constructing a message from your experience, and then on from there the construction of the utterance and so on. In the construction of the message, the most important thing is that the rules, the prescriptive rules that the protocol uses to tell you how to act, those prescriptive rules go from the important semantic elements that you want to talk about onto the details gradually. So basically, we I worked with a sentence in English as an example, but generally speaking, the idea was when you start thinking about communicating, language tells you, first of all, make the first big choices. Decide whether you're going to assert or ask or promise or threat and so on. So decide which speech act you're going to use. And remember, we talked about that in the second lecture. Speech acts are linguistic constructions. They are also elements that have been decided upon by the community. There is variability in speech acts between languages, but also there's the more fundamental issue is that once we start thinking about communicating, it's not always clear to us whether we're going to assert or ask or whatever. Language tells us, start by making this decision, decide who you're going to talk about, which entity is going to be your topic, and decide what kind of activity you want to talk about. And as I said, I think 3 or 4 times last time, it's very important for me to stress this point, the best way to understand the prescriptive nature of the protocol, the fact that this thing is not something that you just use freely, but it's something that you have to use according to certain rules. The best way to understand this is to, for those of us who are parents, to think about our kids, for those of us who are not, to think, think about your brother's kids or sister's kids or your own sisters or whatever. When a child at a certain age, 3 or 4, comes to you very excited, wanting to say something, what happens many, many times is that you have to stop the child and say, look, what is happening is the child is saying this word and the other word, and you can't make out what the child is wanting to say here, and you have to kind of direct the child through steps in which you have to say to the child, first of all, relax now, tell me, who was it? What happened? Okay? Why? And start to kind of collect the different building blocks of the message. And as long as you're doing this work with the child, you have to kind of participate in giving the orders. Language internalized means you already have the orders in your mind, and the orders say, first of all, make the big decisions. Your experience is ineffable. The thing that you want to say is not constructed in terms of language. First of all, decide. What kind of speech act is it going to be? What kind of activity you want to talk about? Who or what is the topic? Then on the basis of these selections, there's another set of questions that language asks you to answer. For example, if you talk about an event of breaking, you have to specify what was broken, who broke, and you can specify, for example, did it happen in the past, did it happen in the future, all kinds of forms like this that you have to fill in. And the best way, the best metaphor to think about this process is the internet metaphor. Luckily for us, we have the metaphor today. It's exactly the same situation as when you have to fill out a form on the internet. You fill out the form, press enter, and as on the basis of what you wrote, on the basis of what you already filled in, you get another form to fill in, and then another one, and another one. Iteratively, language allows you to do that from the generalities to the details. So for example, you choose a breaking event, a vase that was broken, past. Language asks you, okay, that vase that you now mentioned, here's a set of questions. Plural, singular, is it one vase or many? Or many? Is there a property of the vase that you want to mention? Is it beautiful? Is it expensive? Is it any of these things? Did it participate in another event? So for example, you may say, I want to specify that it participated in a buying event. Okay? So it asks you again, who bought, where, why, and so on, and in the end, what you get is an embedded sentence. So you get all these elements together. So in the example that I just gave, you can end up with a sentence like, the boy broke the vase that I bought at the market, or something like that. But language tells you, proceed in a certain way, and answer specific questions, which means that the whole process of message construction is a process in which society kind of tells you inside your mind what are the procedures by which you can translate your experience into something that the others can understand, because everything that you do is already based on the mutual identification of rules and the mutual identification of the meanings of words and so on. So you translate everything into a message, and then language tells you how to translate it into an utterance, and then how to produce it as sound and then the listener has to go through the whole process again of translating it back until the listener gets to a point where hopefully the listener has a certain experiential interpretation, meaning that the listener has managed to first of all, construct a semantic message, understand which building blocks are there, how they are connected to each other semantically, and so on, and then take each of these semantic elements, each of these signifieds, connect them again to the cluster of experiences that the listener has in his or her mind, and construct some kind of experiential interpretation on the basis of the message. And if everything worked right, if there wasn't too much noise, if the speaker and listener share the same mutually identified system, the same language, and if the speaker and listener have similar enough experiences to begin with, then the end of the whole process will be one in which the listener will have an experiential interpretation which is indeed similar enough to what the speaker actually wanted to say in the very beginning. But when you look at this system, of course, you can see all the different ways in which it can go wrong, and all the different ways in which an act of communication may even feel to the two sides as successful, but actually the experiential interpretation of the listener would be very different from that of the speaker. And we talked about all kinds of issues relating to this question of how efficient language is and so on. I said that the general conception of language that comes out of this whole story is of a much weaker and much more fragile system than we got used to thinking about. And there are many empirical and theoretical problems that I will not touch on, which I think profit from this understanding, from this weakening, this weakening of language. We all grew up. I think the second half of the 20th century was, in a paradoxical way, the age of the omnipotence of language. Everybody, or many people in different disciplines, have thought and talked about language as an omnipotent system that is capable of expressing everything. John Searle's dictum, for example, everything that can be meant can be said, is a very important one, and so on. And then on the other hand, a lot of the postmodern writers who, in a wave of rage that was based on the understanding that language is not omnipotent, set out to basically destroy the whole story and say that there's nothing there. What I'm trying to do here, and I'm not going to talk about it now for a long time, what I'm trying to do here as a general thing is to break away from the image of language as an omnipotent system of communication and talk about it in a way that wears its limitations on its sleeve. And this way, I think some of the problems that arise from the over-critique of postmodernism on language will be, you could get better answers for these things and come back to the question of truth in a more indirect way, and all these things. I'm not going to talk about them today. The thing that I want to talk about today is the following. The most important question that linguists, as in general linguists, people who have done general linguistics, not Semitic or Indo-European, but like general linguistic, the most important question has been the relationship between form and function. And in a different way, you can formulate the same question as in, is language a functional system? Okay? Now, it's a very, very paradoxical state of affairs for everybody who is not a linguist, because everybody knows, I mean, this is like self-evident that language is a functional system. We use it to communicate. There doesn't seem to be anything clearer than that. On the other hand, the question that was directing research and thought since 1957 with the publication of syntactic structures, Chomsky's syntactic structures, was not what kind of functional system language is, or what we can say about its function, or how its forms are related to function and so on, but whether language is a functional system at all. And Chomsky's answer was very, very clear: it is not. Okay? The fact that we use it for communication is undeniable, but it is also irrelevant. We use many things for many different functions. It doesn't mean that the function tells us anything significant about the thing itself. The example that I gave here last time, because some people here weren't here, I will use it again. It sounds stupid, I'm sorry to say, but this is the example we've all got. This is like the textbook example. You know those very thick telephone books with all the numbers of, all the numbers of telephone numbers in Budapest, for example, a phone book. You sometimes use a phone book to replace a light bulb. You put it on the chair and stand on it in order to get high enough to get to the light bulb. This means that there is a function to the book, which is to help you replace the light bulb, but it doesn't mean that you can say anything significant about the book itself on the basis of what you use it for. So, of course, we use language for communication, but that doesn't mean that language is a functional system. Language is a structural system, it is a formal system. The essence of the system is in the formal properties of the structures. Okay? Some of you have heard about deep structure and surface structure, for example. These are notions that have, gotten out of usage because now there are different notions, but the basic idea is that language generates an infinite number of sentences, okay, which are grammatical, sentences that are good in the language. And then there's another infinite number of sentences, possible sentences, which are ungrammatical. Okay? If I say, I went to school yesterday, this is a good sentence in English. If I say, I too went to school yesterday, then there's something wrong in the sentence. Everybody knows, every speaker of English knows that there's something wrong in the sentence. The goal of linguistic theory, not just from Chomsky, but from the American structuralists before him, the goal of linguistic theory was basically to understand what determines the difference between grammaticality and non-grammaticality. The system generates an infinite number of grammatical sentences, which means that there is a set of structural constraints or rules or regulations, or whichever way you want to call them. They are constitutive of the system. They do not regulate communication. They are the essence of the system. And our goal as general linguists is to figure out, understand what this set is. In Chomsky's view, the underlying constraints that are there below language, which determine what's grammatical and what's not, are universal. So the variability that we see on the surface between languages is a shallow fact. Actually, everything is the same at a deeper level, and what is the same and what is important and what is also innate and unlearned from the environment are structural rules. Formal rules basically are mathematics of structural organization of signifiers. The real question is, why does a word appear here and another word appear there? Why can't they appear in a different organization? Why does this word have to be close to this one? Why can't they be in such a distance at the sentence? And sentences are described in terms of syntactic trees. There is a hierarchical representation of signifiers, and there are different rules, most of which are very, very complex mathematically, that are supposed to tell you which sentences are good and which sentences are not good. And the basic idea is, regardless of what the words mean, regardless of what the sentences mean, regardless of what people use these sentences for, grammaticality, the essence of what is good and what is not good in language, has nothing to do with meaning and with function. It's a purely structural thing. Okay? This was an idea that Chomsky actually got from the American structuralists, but developed much more in his own theory. And what you got in the second half of the 20th century was a very, very long argument between Chomsky, with a view that I just presented, and his rivals, functionalists, obviously, and cognitivists. Okay, that would sound a little strange for people who are not from the domain, but don't pay too much attention to this. These are people who are working in basically the same ways, and for internal reasons of the discipline, they call themselves by two different names. So functionalists and cognitivists have always said language is functional. The facts of language are related to the function of language, and the structures and the structural constraints of language have to be explained on the basis of the function. Okay? So this seems to be intuitively, for people outside linguistics is a more reasonable idea. However, things are not that simple. Because beyond all the other theoretical issues that people have argued about endlessly, there's also a very, very important set of empirical issues. The last 15 years in linguistics have been, to a very large extent, a long and extended argument about examples, where generativists, Chomskyans, bring on more and more examples of structural facts about language that cannot be reduced to the function of language, that cannot be reduced to meaning. And functionalists have gone on bringing examples of things that can be reduced to meaning, with each side trying to disprove the other side's example and to strengthen his or her example, and basically it has deteriorated, in my view, into a very long argument about fine-grained judgments. What usually happens to linguists when they get into these arguments, and this would probably be very bizarre for everybody who's not a linguist, but this is part of the profession, people would start putting sentences on the board, arguing about some of them that they are ungrammatical and about others that they are good. And then other people in the crowd would say, no, this sentence is actually good for me, I can say this sentence. And another person would say, this sentence that you said is good for me, I can pronounce it or I can't utter it, and so on. And the argument would deteriorate again and again into personal judgments about grammaticality, and then the question of how many people you should ask in a survey about a sentence in order to decide is it grammatical or not, and so on. And a very long process that hasn't brought many positive results. The crux of the matter, as far as I'm concerned, is the fact that in a way, in a deep way, both sides have been right all along. Okay? And there are certain ways in which Chomsky's very strange perception of language as something that is a structural phenomenon that cannot be reduced to function. There's something there is at the empirical level that is very right, but there's also something very right about the functionalist view that says that eventually it's about, everything there is about the function. And the big step that I'm going to make today has the following structure. The one thing that both sides to the argument share is a cognitive conception of what language is. For both sides, language is about the mental processes in the mind, and for both sides, society and the social significance of language is not an important element of the story. What I'm saying is I'm going to bring society back into the story based on the story that I've told in the last 3 lectures, and I think that on the basis of everything that I've said now, we'll get a third view about the relationship between form and meaning, which as far as I'm concerned is almost like a perfect synthesis between the two sides, and for me, a resolution of the paradox. Let me start with one example. Of course, for linguists, the examples become more fun the more complicated they are, but I'm not going to throw very, extremely complicated things on you just because I think most times it's just very boring for people who are not from this profession. But let me start with one example that I think is important enough and representative enough of the whole thing. Okay, think about the notion of subject. Okay, the subject of the sentence. All right. For most people, this is what we've been told in school, and this is what the functionalists have always said. The topic of the sentence is what the sentence is about. Okay? So if I say, John broke the vase, then John is the subject of the sentence, and the sentence is about John. Okay? There are 2 types of issues that come up when you just say that. One is a problem of the regular type that we always find ourselves facing when we try to do research. The other is more fundamental. The more regular one is that it's not very clear what aboutness is in this whole story, and it's a difficult understanding what aboutness is. For example, when you say John broke the vase, it's not at all very clear that what the person who utters the sentence wanted to talk about was John. Maybe it's even quite reasonable to assume in certain cases that the person wanted to talk about the vase. The vase was broken, and he said, John broke the vase. So the whole question of aboutness is vague, is difficult, and so on. And there we are in a regular kind of situation. People on the functionalist side produce better and better definitions of what aboutness is, and so on. This is a simple thing. The more complicated thing from the point of view of what we're talking about here is that Chomsky had said, and his, many of his followers have elaborated on this point, is that there are many cases in which we use a subject in a sentence, and it is quite clear that the thing that we put there in subject position cannot be what the sentence is about because it's nothing. Okay? For example, there is the way we say in English, it's raining, okay? Or in French, okay? And there are languages, like Hebrew, for example, in which you don't need the subject there. You just say Yored Geshem, meaning rain, okay? But the most importantly, in English, it's not at all clear what the it here refers to, okay? It's not like, it doesn't say the rain is raining, and it doesn't say the drops are raining, it doesn't say the clouds. The it here seems to be what the literature calls an expletive subject, an empty subject or whatever. It doesn't refer to anything. And the idea, from the generativist point of view, from the Chomskyan point of view, the idea is that examples of expletive subjects and other examples show you the following thing. A subject is a position in the sentence. Okay? The sentence has a certain position, subject, object, indirect object, a verb, and so on. Okay? In terms of the syntactic tree, the way things are represented in the theory, okay? John broke the vase. Okay, this is the sentence. Okay, this is the subject, the verb, the determiner, the object. Okay, and the subject is a position on the syntactic tree. In technical terms, it is the first daughter of the sentence. Okay, you think about the different nodes of the tree as being mothers and daughters. This is the technical jargon, okay? And you see that there is a direct relationship here, one step from sentence to subject, but two steps from sentence to object, okay? So the distinction between subject and object is a distinction that has to do with the mathematics of the relationship here on the tree, and subjects are first daughters of S, and of course I'm simplifying here, but this is the general way that things are being thought about. And then English tells you that subject position has to be filled for formal structural reasons, having nothing to do with what you want to use the language for, communicate meaning and so on. Subject position has to be filled, which means that it has to be filled in situations where you have someone to put there. But it must also be filled in situations where you have nothing to put there. You have to put the it there, simply because there must be something there. Okay? And when you look at expletive subjects and other types of examples, you see from the generative grammar is Chomsky's theory, so I say generativist and Chomsky they're the same thing. From the generativist structural point of view, the subject is not what the sentence is about. The subject is a structural position. In English it has to be filled. In Hebrew, for example, sometimes it may not be filled. In Spanish it may not be filled, and so on. There may be other structural formal reason for why this is the case, but there's nothing to do with the function. It's a structural position. Okay? Okay, fine. Now, functionalists, on the other hand, say, look, there's another set of facts about subjects that are relevant for this issue. Think about what happens to sentences when you actually use them in discourse. So, for example, you ask, where is John? And the answer is, went to the market to get some food. Okay? What is happening there? The answer says, went to, and so on. There's no subject. Okay? The subject position is empty. Alright? Subject position is empty. Why is it empty? Because what the sentence is about is already known to the other people who are in the conversation on the basis of the question. Okay, we ask, where is John? So now everybody knows what the sentence, what the answer is going to be about, who the answer is going to be about, and because everybody knows, you can actually give up on the subject and leave things here. Okay, which means that subject is functional. And it is related to the notion of aboutness. Okay? What do generalists say about this? They say, hey, there's a distinction that is very, very important that we have learned from de Saussure and Chomsky adopted and developed. That's the distinction between competence and performance. Knowledge of language is a matter of competence. It comes into play when we ask people about their judgments. Performance is what actually happens. This is the parole. This is what happens when we actually speak. And in parole, in performance, all kinds of things happen. For example, I start a sentence and then I stop it in the middle and I hesitate and I say and ooh and all these things. If we want to understand the essence of language, we have to abstract away from performance and only think about competence. If we abstract away from performance, we get rid of examples of this type because they are part of what is actually happening to us. Generativists say if you actually take a sentence in isolation and ask a speaker of English, can you say a sentence that sounds like went to the market to buy some food? Everybody would tell you this is an ungrammatical sentence, meaning that this fact is irrelevant to what is going on. What would the functionalists say about this? They say, okay, fine, let's distinguish between competence and performance. As far as we're concerned, competence is irrelevant. Competence is just an idealization. When you come to someone and ask about whether a sentence is grammatical or not, all kinds of other things happen. The really important issue is to see how people actually use the language. They actually use the language in this way, which means that this is relevant, and this is, I think in like 10 minutes I have managed to summarize 50 years of arguments about different elements of language, and it has never, almost never, as far as I'm concerned, went beyond this type of argument. It's a very stable state that linguistics has been in for. It's very funny to see how Chomsky in 57 writes 3 pages on this type of thing, actually using the example of subject, basically summarizing all the different ways in which the argument can flow from there, and it went exactly in the lines that he said. He set up the rules for the game of the argument, and everybody kind of, went along with that. Okay. So, the thing that I'm offering here is basically the following. Let's think about the relationship between subject and aboutness, not in the sense that the functionalists and the cognitivists are talking about it, saying that the subject is what the sentence is about. But let's think about the relationship as a prescriptive rule that says the subject is what the sentence should be about. Okay? It does not, it is part of the legal code of the language. It is part of the protocol. It tells speakers. They tell those children that we talked about before. Okay? First of all, it says the following thing. Look, for me, in order to be able to understand you, if I have any chance of constructing an interpretation of what you say that will be similar enough to what you were trying to say, some order has to be put into this. We have to go through steps that both of us can mutually recognize, because otherwise I'm lost. It's just what's happening with the child. You're saying all these words, I cannot connect them to each other. I need you from the very beginning, this is what I said half an hour ago, I need you to make a few decisions at the very beginning of your message construction, one of which would be to decide who or what you're going to talk about. Okay? Now, as a rule, because this is the rule that I expect you to obey, it does not depend on the question of whether at the moment you have something that you want to talk about. It does not depend on the question of whether you at the moment feel an experience of aboutness in you that would create something that the sentence is about. It means you have to go by the rule, and the rule is socially constructed. Okay? It says, when you start the process, those who were here last week may probably see it in their mind better, because we went through all the different stages of the production process, but basically start by deciding what happened, who or what it happened to, this is the topic, and what type of speech act you want to start with. Okay. This means that speakers are forced to choose, okay? And if they have nothing to choose of their own, they have to put something there, like an eat in the e-training or whatever, because the rule is forced on you as a legal rule, whether or not there are reasons in the environment that cause you to actually do it on your own. It's the same situation with traffic lights. There's a rule that says the light is red, you're not supposed to cross the street. Okay? You're there at 2 o'clock in the morning, there are no cars around whatsoever. The rule doesn't say when there are no cars you can cross. The rule says you have to stand until there's green light. Okay? So the rule says there must be something that the sentence is about. It is unrelated to the question of whether you have something to contribute to that person. Okay. What does that mean? It means two things. First, you as the speaker have to decide what the sentence is going to be about, choose a topic. But then there's another thing that is implied by this. The whole process has to be done in a way that is mutually identified with the listener. It's not enough for the speaker to decide what the sentence is going to be about. The listener has to be in a position to actually figure out what the sentence is about, otherwise there's no point in doing the whole thing. So, two issues have to be taken care of in the linguistic protocol, in the communication protocol, the set of regulations, the set of prescriptive regulations. One is a rule that tells you that you have to do something in the process of message construction. This is what we just said. And the second is some rule of marking the element that was chosen to be subject at the level of the signifiers, so that the listener will be able to detect which element it is. Okay? So, in many languages, for example, there is the nominative case. You have to mark that element with a certain morpheme that says to the listener, this is the mutually identified morpheme that we have selected, and if you see something that has the nominative case attached to it, you know that this is what the sentence has to be about according to the rules of the language. In English, this is done with word order. Okay? The element that was chosen as the subject has to be, the other things being equal, the first element in the sentence. Of course, there are other things that can happen here, like, as far as I'm concerned, John wrote about it, but don't worry about this. These are later elements. We don't have to worry about them right now. Other things being equal, it's the first thing in terms of the linear order, first thing in the sentence. Okay. So what this means is that when I start the process of translating my experience, my experiential intent into a message, there's something that language forces me to do that is not necessarily what I wanted to express. Okay? Maybe I wanted to express all kinds of stuff, and I wasn't very interested in the identity of the perpetrator of the activity that I was talking about, or whatever, but language tells me, decide what you're going to do. There's more than one option that language gives me. For example, I can decide that the vase can be what I want to talk about, but then language will tell me, okay, fine, this is okay, but you have to use the verb in a passive form to say that the vase was broken or whatever. There are other options. But if I want to talk about a certain active activity, I want to talk about the activity of breaking, language tells me, okay, if that's the case, you have to tell me something about the identity of the breaker, and this is going to have to be the what the sentence is about. Okay? And you have to mark that thing in a way that the listener will also be able to identify. Now, if you think about subjecthood as a prescriptive rule in this way, then the whole question of what performance and competence are changes its significance. Because it's not about the internal competence that we have for language as linguistic animals, the way Chomsky thinks about it, and then on the other side, the unimportant or the only important thing, which is how we actually use language. The question of competence and performance becomes a question about two different types of activities that we may engage in. One is the actual usage of this whole machinery, of this whole technology for communication, which is what the technology is supposed to be about, meaning the way we go with the rules of the protocol in order to produce utterances that may eventually, hopefully, be mutually identified with the listeners. And then there's another question about a different activity in which we are asked by professional people like linguists whether we know the law or not. Okay? There's a situation where linguists come to us and ask, is this sentence good for you, is this sentence not good for you? And if you think about the question of good and bad sentences in terms of this prescriptive set of rules, what the question of grammaticality means in this kind of situation is, do you know the law or not? Okay? Linguists, in this sense, are like, people who, drag you through an exam of any other type of legal code. Okay? Let me say in parentheses. A lot of the times, people who do general linguistics and are not very sensitive to all the social issues find it difficult to understand why situations where you ask speakers about grammaticality judgments, why these situations are difficult for many of the speakers, why they feel like uncomfortable, why you get constructing answers from contrasting answers from people and so on. If you think about the rules of language, the rules of the protocols, as rules that were constructed socially and kind of put in our minds in a prescriptive way, telling us how to behave, then it is quite evident that the situation where someone who's like a linguistic professional, who, from the point of view of most people who I've worked with, if I'm a linguist, this means that I know all the little secrets of language, which of course I don't, I'm trying to understand them. But here's someone who knows everything about language asking me if I know what is grammatical and what is not. People become defensive, all kinds of interesting things happen. And what is happening, as far as I'm concerned, is something that can be very easily described in terms of our relationship with the law, in the same way as with the laws of, driving and drinking, or passing on a red light, or wherever. Okay. And there are basically three types of situations. Somebody comes to me and says, do you know the law? I'm now examining you. Do you know where you should put a subject or not? Okay? The answer would be, you can't have a subject. You can't have a sentence without subject in English. Okay? Four situations. Okay? So when you're asked for your competence in the generativist point of view, you ask, is it okay to say went to the market? Okay? And the sentence is provided to you out of context. Then you're going to say, no, this is impossible. Okay? You cannot cross the the street on a red light, even if it's 2 o'clock in the morning, because you're not supposed to do these things. Now, there are many situations in which there is an element of aboutness that emerges from my experiential intent anyway. There's someone I want to talk about, or something that I want to talk about, and in this case, the protocol of the language is user-friendly to me in a certain way. The protocol of the language tells me choose a subject, and I choose a subject that is actually the subject that I want to talk about, and the whole thing flows very nicely, and I produce a sentence like, John broke the vase, and it's just fine, okay? This is like the prototypical situation. Then there are situations in which, in the flow of discourse, functionally, everybody already knows what the subject of the next sentence is going to be, like, for example, the situation where somebody asks, where is John? Okay? So I know, as a good native speaker, I know as a good native speaker of English, that in this kind of situation I have to say, John went to the market to get some food. Okay, this is the rule. But I look to all sides, I see that there are no police officers, and I say, went to the market, just like I crossed the street at 2 a.m., because functionally, discourse allows me to give up on this, because actually, as a speaker, all I'm interested in is getting my message across. Think about this notion of getting the message across. Okay, it's across the experiential gap in this saying, and I allow myself, in this kind of situation, to just disregard the law. Okay? And then there are all kinds of situations in which the rule, the legal code, asserts itself, like the best examples of how you have to behave in society with respect to language. And the it's raining thing is one of those examples where the rule has to apply all across the board. This is the essence of the rule. And one of the best examples of the fact that it has to apply whether you have something to talk about or not is this kind of situation, which is like, you can think about it as the way you think about little stories for children about what happens to people who disobey the law. It's like a symbol of what it means to obey the rules of language. Okay? So what you have here is a situation where, on the one hand, Chomsky is actually right in the sense that you cannot reduce the notion of subjecthood to the function of aboutness in a one-to-one fashion. There are many cases in which you have a subject, but you don't have anything that the sentence is about. In many cases, there are situations where the sentence is about something, but you don't have a subject. The subject is autonomous from function in a very real sense. Okay? But the functionists are also right in the sense that the notion of subject is related to aboutness. The whole issue here is that it is related to aboutness not in the sense of reducing one to the other, but in the sense that the subject is a prescriptive rule designed to regulate the process of communication around the notion of aboutness. Okay? Think about this whole thing in terms of the experiential gap. Okay? Some of us, and you can see this very beautifully in the differences between different children. Some children, at a very, very early age, are very neat in the sense that they have a very good grasp of what it is that they have to do for the other to understand what they're saying. Okay? So, by themselves, as part of their almost intuition, I think that's the best word I can think of, by themselves, they take the trouble to tell you, now I'm talking about this, now I'm talking about the other thing. Think about it, for example, in this relationship of changing topics of conversation. It's not a very easy thing. Sometimes somebody talks about something, and then you think that you're going talking about this. Now it turns out the next 5 sentences were about something completely different, and you haven't noticed, and all kinds of stuff like that can happen. There are other children and other adults, okay, who are unbelievably bad in this way. They would start a conversation with you saying like, I don't know, he went to the market, and you'd say, who, you know, or actually give a name without figuring out whether you know who this person is, all kinds of things like that. So there are experiential gaps between people in exactly the question of aboutness, as there are in all other ways. And one of the things that society has done in terms of this negotiation of mutual identification is saying, for us to be able to communicate better, we have to say for each sentence what it's about. Once you think about subjecthood in this prescriptive way, the set of problems, this is, of course, these are the easiest ones, there are more complex ones. The set of problems that are involved here, as far as I can tell, is resolved. Let me give you another example that may be more familiar to many of you, because it has become very relevant, not just for linguists, but also for anthropologists and people who are doing social sciences. The distinction between nouns and verbs. Okay? So again, nouns and verbs are linguistic notions. Maybe the only structural distinction that is shared by all languages of the world. Okay? This is one of the most important conclusions of a domain in linguistics that's called typology, that has actually done to the trouble of actually figuring out what you find in all kinds of languages that haven't been researched until recently. There's a lot of stuff, for example, subjecthood is not something that you find in all languages. There are many languages without subjects. Okay? They manage very well because they have other ways of marking things, but you know, subject is not universal. It seems, for a long time there was an argument about one Native American language called Nootka. Researchers have said it doesn't have a distinction between nouns and verbs. Now everybody kind of seems to agree that they do have some distinction. So let's assume that it's a universal distinction. And it is a structural distinction. Nouns and verbs are classes of words in the language. Okay? What would the functionalists say? Nouns refer to entities in the world, things, people, places, and so on. Verbs refer to actions, activities, accomplishments, and so on. This is the general functionalist view. Okay? The generativist would say, quite simply, this would be nice if that were the case, but it's not the case, because if you think about nouns like dance or war or fire, okay, then these are things that refer to things that happen, not to entities. Okay, if you think about the war, for example, okay, it's a set of activities and events that happen. If you have to decide on a word, I give you a word, and I say, okay, let me retreat for one, arrange this sentence the right way. Okay, the question is the following. Functionalists say you can identify whether something is a word, is a verb, or a noun on the basis of what it refers to, in the sense that I give you a word you don't know, and I show you what it refers to, and on the basis of what it refers to, you can tell me whether it's a verb or a noun. That's the whole idea of the functionalist idea. Okay? So I give you a word, and I refer to somebody who's dancing. Okay? Then you can see it yourself. I refer to the verb dance and the noun dance by pointing at the same type of person. You cannot tell about the noun dance that it's a noun on the basis of what you saw there. I refer to a war, for example. What you see is a lot of activities happening. Most chances are, if you go with this logic, you'd say, okay, war is a verb. Okay, they are warring. But the war is a noun. Okay? What this means for generativists is that even if there are resemblances between the functional definition and what is actually happening, in the sense that, say, most nouns refer to things and people, and most verbs refer to entities and so on, the resemblance is very imperfect, okay? And the only way to think seriously about nouns and verbs is to abstract away from all this functional stuff and understand that if you see, for example, if you go back to this structural tree, the syntactic tree, and what you have to say is verbs are entities that can attach to nodes around here. And nouns are entities that can attach to nodes of the tree around here. And determiners are entities that can join the tree here. Okay? So there's a certain formal mathematical arrangement of hierarchical relationships on the syntactic tree. And one of the things, for example, that we know about language is that the immediate daughter of sentence, which is subject position, is a position in which only nouns can enter, okay? And the fact that we know that war is a noun is a result of the fact that we know that we can say the war has started, or they have started the war. We put the word war in the places where it's supposed to be structurally, and this is how we know that it's a noun. Some of the nouns, of course, would refer to things in the world like tables and chairs and people, but that's not the issue. The issue is the structural relationship. So again, the very same type of argument about what would be a relevant judgment and what would not be a relevant judgment, and fine-grained judgments to this side and to the other. And what does it mean that war does not refer to a thing? What is an activity? What is that? And what is that? Okay. The whole argument is again based on the same agreement, tacit agreement between the two sides. Okay. It's an agreement about the rules of the intellectual game, just like in the story of the subject. Okay. The game that Chomsky devised said the functionalist claim would be right if you can look at a certain experience, right, and then tell on the basis of this experience whether the thing that refers to it is a noun or a verb, okay? And once you put the game this way, Chomsky is actually right. There is no way you can look at a word and say, before you know the language itself, whether the word that refers to it is a verb or a noun. Chomsky is actually right, and the functionalists are actually wrong. But think about the functionalist notions, not as statements of what there is, but as prescriptive statements about what should be, and you see that things actually fall into place. So, a noun is not an entity, is not a word that refers to names and things and so on. If you refer to something in the world with a noun, then you should think of that thing as an entity or a place, and so on, okay? If you refer to something in the world with a verb, then you should think about that thing that we refer to as an activity, okay? Let me spell this out just a little bit. Remember that we said that you have different people with their own experiential worlds, with differences and similarities between these experiential worlds, and a symbolic landscape that they construct between them with digital points which are supposed to refer to points of mutual agreement about their reference. So once I point at the chair and you look at my finger pointing at the chair and you look at the same thing, we say, okay, this thing now, for the purposes of linguistic communication, is something that we will call a chair. All right? Now, think about the process of the relationship between the experiences and what is happening on the symbolic landscape, not just as a process in which one person points at an experience that is his or hers, asking the others to see whether they have something that is similar enough for them, and we'll call it by name and so on. Think of it as a process that eventually creates for each of these people a statement about which elements in my experience are elements that are already mutually identified with the others. Okay? So for example, there are certain things in my experience that would not have a name. For example, we talked about that last time because there's a taboo in the society about talking about these things, but there are all kinds of many other reasons for that. Most importantly, the fact that this social process is a very long and tiresome process and we cannot do it, and there's no reason for us to do it for every little bit of the experience of each and every one of us. We look for generalities that we can identify as mutually identified, which means that the naming process, the process of naming, the process of relating language to our experiences, is not a process that goes directly from my experience to the symbolic landscape. It's actually a process that goes from the symbolic landscape to my experience. Language tells me something about my experience and about the way I should conceptualize my experience for the purposes of communicating with other people who have different experiences. Okay? Which means that once you construct Chomsky's question with the direction of the arrow this way, from experience to language, there's no reason that you cannot find a way to reduce language to experience, okay? Which means that the functionalists are actually right in Chomsky's game. If you cannot reduce language to experience, and there's no arrow in the other direction, there's no other way but to say that what there is here is autonomous from meaning, okay? But if you think about the direction of the arrows this way, language is a prescriptive system that, in order to allow for communication between people whose experiences are different, actually tells the different people how they should construct their experiences in order to be able to talk to the others. If you understand influence of the arrow in this direction, then you can say, okay, one of the arrows here says, if you have an experience that you use a noun for, that you use a noun in order to refer to, then for the purposes of communication you should think of it as an entity. So war, for example, or dance, is not something that by its very essence is verbal or nominal. What is happening is that by inventing the word war in the process of the social construction of meaning, that was the topic of the first lecture, by calling something in the world a war, what the language, that is the community of people who have constructed the language, what the language has said effectively is, for purposes of communication, we are going to refer to that experience as if it was nominal. We are going to refer to this experience as an entity. Basically, what it means is we're going to take a very, very complex set of experiences that there are there, generalize over all of them, and call the whole envelope of experiences that you have there a war, meaning we'll call it, it will be an item, it will be something in the world, like a table or a chair, and for the purposes of communication, we'll be able to say stuff like 3 wars, just like we say 3 chairs. Okay? Once you think about the relationship between form and meaning in a prescriptive way, the problems actually are made to disappear. The generalization of the whole story is actually the following. Okay? The argument has been constructed in terms of a relationship between meaning and form, or meaning and structure. Okay? Both sides to the argument agreed that there is a level of structure that has to be accounted for, and there is something called meaning, which is outside of language. It is the thing that we want to talk about. It is that thing that, in our terms, we experience. And the question was whether it is possible to reduce one to the other. The story that I'm telling here in my theory of language says the following thing. There is a level of meaning meaning that is experiential and also different between different people. And there is a level of form in language, of course. Nouns, verbs, subjects, word order, all kinds of issues much more complicated than what I talked about before. As long as you think about these two entities as such, there is indeed no way to reduce one to the other, which means that Chomsky is right and the functionalists are wrong. However, there is another level of meaning, which is important here, and that is the level of linguistic meaning. Linguistic meaning is everything that is being told to us by the symbolic landscape, the semantic relationships between the elements of the symbolic landscape, and all the rules, the meaning-based rules in the protocol. Linguistic meaning is a different level of meaning. It is not experiential, it is not private, it is social. It comes to us from language, and it tells us of the generalizations of meaning that are, how should I say, socially arranged, negotiated, mutually identified within the society and so on. Once you put language inside linguistic meaning between the two of those, once you insert the society between these two elements that are thought of as cognitive, what you see is the following thing. Linguistic meaning cannot be reduced and is not correlated to experiential meaning. There are resemblances, otherwise we wouldn't be able to communicate, but for each of us, our experiential world is not exactly the same as what language tells us. There is a discrepancy between the meanings of language and our private experiences. This is why we find it so difficult so much of the time to put our thoughts into words. This is why language is always not perfectly suited for our communicative purposes. Okay? So there is no full correlation between linguistic meaning and experiential meaning. This thing is a result of a social process whose very definition is based on the idea that it cannot be reduced to just the experiential meanings of one of us, because it has to be good enough for all of us, and we have different experiences, so this thing has to be some kind of compromise. It has to be something that is unlike any of the experiences. It is supposed to be like something like common ground or whatever, okay? So this thing cannot be reduced to this. There is no correlation, okay? Linguistic meaning and linguistic form are totally correlated with each other, okay? The idea of aboutness, once you think about it not as a part of our experience of communication, but as part of the prescriptions that language tells us with how to use, the notion of aboutness as a prescription is perfectly correlated with the formal properties of subjecthood, both in terms of the choice of subject, the positioning of subject at the linear order in English, the marking of subject by nominative in other types of languages, the fact that you sometimes avoid using the subject when discourse tells you that you can actually break the law, and all these things. So, the one thing that was shared by both sides to the argument was the idea that you have two elements in the story. Once you add a third element, and you understand that linguistic form is correlated, is not autonomous from linguistic meaning, but linguistic meaning is not correlated, is to a certain extent autonomous from experiential meaning, then what you get is a story of the relationship between linguistic form and two types of meanings, not just one. And when you think about it this way, the empirical problems that get to a much higher magnitude, I'm not going to get into this, there are questions of idle constraints and all kinds of very, very complex issues of the syntax. The questions can be resolved. You acknowledge the fact that the general functionalist enterprise that tries to reduce this to this is not going to get you anywhere, but you also recognize that this doesn't mean that language is not functional, because the form is indeed perfectly correlated with prescriptive meaning, which comes into our mind from the social negotiation of linguistic communication. Okay, this is the general type of solution. What this means is, as far as I understand it for the first time, we can actually, the first time since syntactic structures, we can actually get back to the question that we should have asked from the very beginning. What type of functional system language is? Okay? Because what we've done for the last 50 years is instead of asking what type of functional system language is, we've asked whether it is a functional system, and we've been quarreling about this relationship, okay? Whereas now that we understand that there are two levels of meaning that are separate from each other, we can actually ask, okay, fine, we understand again that language is functional, and by the way, this is very important for me, as you can see, I go back to this every time. The fact that linguistic meaning is not in full correlation, is actually autonomous from experiential meaning. Okay, the fact that there is no correlation here, it's actually a very, very important fact about the functionality of language. Okay, so the way people have been thinking in the last 50 years was, if we do not find a correlation, this means that the system is not functional, because you need a correlation between form and meaning to show functionality. The very fact that there's no correlation here implies that language is functional, okay? Because the function of language resides exactly in the construction of common ground for communication between individuals whose experiences are different. Therefore, in order for it to be functional, it must be, at least to a certain extent, autonomous in its meanings from the experiential meanings that each and every one of us has. Okay? Had it been the case in a very different world that all of us would experience completely the same thing, and it would all be like, you know, little robots who just think and feel and go through the same histories in the very, very same way, maybe the way the question was formulated by Chomsky and by his rivaling functionalists would be the right way. But language as it is, as a social invention, is based on the idea that we experience differently. Therefore, the meanings that language can express have to be autonomous, at least to a certain extent, from the experiences that each of them and every one of us feels, which means that both the correlation between linguistic meaning and linguistic form and the fact that linguistic meaning is not correlated with experiential meaning, not fully correlated, both these facts are indications of the social function of language. All right? Which means, as I said before, that we can now start asking the question of what is the function of language. And here again, we find ourselves in an almost paradoxical situation. Chomsky, Pinker, all the people in the structural domain have never given any thought to the question of what the function of language is, because as far as they are concerned, the most important facts about language are structural, formal. Language doesn't have a function. Okay? When we get to talk about the evolution of language, in the 6th lecture, you'll see there the question of function becomes very, very important. Something that doesn't have a function cannot evolve. As far as Chomsky is concerned, in a series of papers, this means that the question of language is going to be more, of the evolution of language is just going to be more difficult because it doesn't have a function, so we have to explain its evolution in a different way. His last idea is that the formal mathematical properties of language, which are non-functional, evolved as tools that helped human beings, hominids, early hominids, navigate in their environment. And then these formal mathematical capacities that evolved for navigation were recruited for the construction of language, which means that language evolved without a function. Okay, and this is a very, very weak evolutionary claim. We'll get to that in the last lecture. But the functionalists on the other side of this quarrel didn't actually make a lot of progress in terms of the understanding of language as a functional system. They were very busy trying to defend the very idea of notion, the very notion of function. And the way they were thinking about it, about language, was as a general purpose communication system. John Searle's idea that I referred to before, everything that can be said is a very good way of summarizing this. the idea of language as a general system of communication basically says that where there are meanings that people want to communicate, language is capable of communicating. Okay? Beyond the fact that this it gives you a picture of unlimited power and capacity, which is again related to the question we talked about before. If language is a system that can express everything that is in it, then it is omnipotent. And we referred in the beginning to this question of modernity and postmodernity and all that. Beyond this, there's a much more fundamental problem there. To say that language is a system of communication is just like to say that vision, for example, is a system for seeing. The function of vision is seeing. And this is not a good enough answer. It is not informative enough to understand what is going on. David Marr, who is probably the most important revolutionary thinker in cognitive science, a very tragic figure because at a very, very early age he wrote a fantastic book that's called Vision, the first really good computational theory of seeing. And then he died very, very young, and he became like this legendary Janis Joplin kind of name. He's a big hero. David Marr starts his book, Vision, with saying it's not good enough to say that vision is for seeing, because this is almost a tautology. We need something with more information in it, with more content. And he starts by saying, look, all animals use vision for seeing, but in order to understand the different visual systems of different animals, we have to understand how different animals see and for what purposes. And different animals see in very different ways. Okay? The best example that he gives, and this is like by now a textbook example, it's a very beautiful example, it is about frogs, which it turns out only see things that move. Okay? And it's an interesting fact. You take a frog that is very, very hungry, okay? And you put a whole pile of dead flies in front of it. And this is like the food that the frog likes best. The frog will die of hunger because it doesn't see things that don't move. It's unbelievable. The frog has a retina that is capable of detecting movement and then assigning properties, nominal properties, to the thing that moves. So if you think about nouns and verbs in human languages, okay, in all the languages that I can think of, I think this is a universal fact about the relationship between nouns and verbs, which, as I said before, is a universal fact. Things that are referred to by nominals go through activities that are referred to by verbs. If you think about a language similar to that would be used by frogs, the language would be the other way around. It's not that the bottle. It's not that. Let me see. It's not that the frog jumps in the frog languages in this sense. It's like the jump frogs. Okay, the first thing that you notice is a movement, and then you assign certain properties to the movement. The movement is froggy in its essence. Okay, so the visual system of the frog, it has certain types of properties. There are certain birds that live off fishing around shores and so on. And you know how even this was the thing that kept Plato from sleeping for a very long time. The fact that when you put a pen inside a glass of water, it seems as if it breaks, right? And you get it out again, it's still the same. Okay, so this is the big issue of suspecting your senses and so on in rationalism. So if you are a bird and you're trying to to catch fish, then this problem is a very big one, because the fish doesn't, to our eyes, the fish, you see the fish in a place where it's not really. It's somewhere close to it, but it's not there. If you want to jump and catch it, you have to be able to see where the fish really is. Okay, so the eyes of certain fishing birds, sea fishing birds, are arranged in a certain way. Their visual system is capable of riding this optical illusion thing. They see the fish where it really is, so they can eat. So David Marr said, let's think about human vision not just as a system of seeing, but as a system that is actually capable of doing something specific, okay? And he develops a theory of human vision that is specific. So the question that we now should move on to is what type of specific function language fulfills. Okay, we've talked about it in different ways throughout the 4 lectures, but now it's time to actually explicate the point, because this is the point that we need in order for us to be able to talk about the evolution of language, okay, which is in a way the most important question that has to be answered. For evolution we need a function. For function we needed to break away from the paradox of form, meaning in order to break away from that we had to tell the story of language in a social way. So this is going backwards, this is the whole process that we went through. I'm not going to go through the whole thing, we'll start with that next time. Let me just say in a few sentences where I'm heading. I'm heading towards a 3-way distinction between 3 types of communication systems that we as humans use. And I will call them presentational, representational, and instructive. Okay? And the idea is this. Presentational systems of communication are totally and perfectly experiential. Okay? I experience something that I want to communicate or that has to be communicated or whatever, and the very fact that I experience this experience creates a certain type of behavior that is totally open to you to see and experience yourselves, okay? And I communicate directly within the realm of shared experience that actually happens at that moment. So, for example, I'm very angry. I go through a process of, an experiential process of being angry. My face gets arranged with a certain facial expression of anger. This is directly visible to you, and you experience my anger just by experiencing my face. This is a direct system of experiential communication. Almost all of the communication in the animal world is done through presentational communication, facial expression, body language, actual fighting, courting of different ways, sounds, grunts, songs, bird songs, and all kinds of things. There's just one known exception, which is the bee dances that tell the others where to go for food, which have elements there that are beyond presentational systems. And of course there are the animals that we don't know enough about, dolphins and whales and so on. Some people say that there's something that is going on there that goes beyond presentational systems, but we still do a lot of presentational communication with our hands, with our bodies, with our eyes and so on. This is one set of systems of communication. Representational communication systems are systems that freeze a certain moment of experience, leave it the same way or reduce it to a certain extent or whatever, and just move it from a certain experiential moment to another one. Okay? So, for example, if there's a wonderful view here, okay, and I do this is presentational communication. Basically, what I'm saying is I present to you the view, just like I present my mood to you when I put on a certain face. Okay? But if I take a photograph of this landscape and I give you the photograph, this is representational communication. The camera, the video, mimicking of different types, pantomime of different types and so on, allow you to almost, with certain prices that you have to pay, recreate the experience away from the moment of the original experience. Okay? There's very little of that in other animals, and there's quite a lot of that in our world with pictures and with videos and with all kinds of other machineries that are relevant. Language is neither presentational nor representational. it has a certain relationship with experience that is very, very unique, very, very different. With the exception of the bees, I don't think there's any other system that works like this, and the bee system is much more simple, much simpler than ours. The idea then is the following. Think about situations where presentational and representational systems can no longer produce the results that you want. Okay? There's something that I want to tell you. There's a certain experiential intent that I have. And I cannot just express this experientially for you to directly see or hear or feel. And I cannot represent it for you in terms of, producing a video. And there is no way that I can share you experientially in my experience. I cannot share my experience with you in experiential ways. Okay? That's the moment in which the third strategy, that is the linguistic strategy, which I call instructive communication, comes into place. And the idea of the function is the following. I give up on any attempt to share the experience with you. What I do is the following. I take my experience, I construct a message that is the first approximation that I can produce for my experience in terms that have already been mutually identified by both of us. I give you this thing and give you the message. We go through all the difficult, complicated processes that I've been talking about. And then what you get when you actually construct the message in your own mind, what I was trying to say, you construct all the semantic relationships between the signifiers and so on, what happens there is that I give you some kind of semantic skeleton at certain points, and I tell you, look, now within your own mind, within your own experiences, try to imagine an experience, okay, that is that is similar to what. Try to construct an experience on the basis of those semantic elements, okay? Try to construct an experience on the basis of this semantic skeleton. So, for example, I cannot do this to show you the view. I cannot take a photograph and show you the photograph. But I can start doing the following. I can tell you, look, it's beautiful. Okay? What does that mean? There's a certain semantic element in the symbolic landscape that we kind of felt that we mutually identified as something semantic. Certain things are beautiful, certain things are not, for example. Okay, it's a very, very complicated question about how we actually got to this type of agreement and what each of us thinks about beautiful and so on. But I tell you it's beautiful, I tell you it's green, I tell you there are trees there, I tell you there's a little house, think of it as red. Put 2 trees near the house and so on. I give you certain instructions on the basis of what is already mutually identified, and I trust you. I have no choice. I have no camera. I cannot show you the view. I trust you within your own experiential world to imagine a view, this time because I'm talking about a visual thing and we are talking about a vision, a real image. But in many other cases it does not have to be a visual image. It can be all kinds of other things. I'm counting on you to imagine an experience, not experience an experience the way I invite you to experience things yourself or to experience the picture. I invite you to imagine an experience on the basis of those skeletal descriptions that I give you. And the idea is, this is something that is the function of this thing starts making sense only when presentational and representational systems break down, cannot work anymore. Okay? So if I'll just take 3 more minutes here, I'll say one thing, and this will be enough material for us to move on to the next lecture. Think, for example, about the presentational system of communication that is involved in practical demonstration. Teaching someone how to tie a knot, or teaching someone how to play the violin, or teaching someone how to, exercise karate, or any of these things. Okay? Presentational teaching of tying a knot involves actually going through the experience so that you can experience the experience with me. So I take a piece of rope and I do this thing, okay? And you saw how I do it, and maybe I'll have to do it once more or 3 times more, depending on how clever we all are with tying knots. But the knowledge that is transferred from one person to the other happens experientially. Okay? I can also create a video of me tying the knot and showing you through the video how to do it, or I can draw in pictures of the stages and so on. Okay? Whenever presentational and representational systems of communication work very well and efficiently, language is almost useless. Let me just find this thing. It's quite fun. Language is almost useless. Here's an attempt by one person that I found in a book to teach someone how to tie a figure of 8, which is the simplest knot, not by showing or demonstrating, not through presentational or representational communication, but through instructive communication, language that gives you the specific points, digital points from the symbolic landscape, and asks you to imagine the experience on the basis of this skeleton. It says the following: there are 5 stages to this thing. The first says, pass the end of the rope over the standing part of the rope. Take the end under the standing part away from the loop. Bring the end of the rope back up over itself towards